Good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation. Unfortunately, my printer decided to break this morning, so I'm reading this from my laptop. So if I'm a bit hesitant in places, that's because the touchpad has gone a bit funny, so you might need to bear with me a bit. But I was delighted to be invited to come and give this talk, and even more delighted when I discovered that the original theme for the talk, prior to me being invited, was to say something about St. John Henry Newman and Benedict XVI. So I thought, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I must stick with that theme and talk about that today. I'm going to do four things. I'm going to talk generally about the way Newman influenced Benedict XVI. I'm then going to talk about the issue of conscience, which is what most people comment on, the fact that there are obvious connections between the way each of them understand the conscience. And then I'll spend most of the time talking about the relation between faith and culture. So each thinker, and in doing so, it will become apparent I'm doing this because I think there are some matters of relevance to the Latin language, and indeed, I would say, the traditional liturgy in that topic as well. So I'll make a start. In his book of memoirs, entitled Milestones, the then Cardinal Ratzinger describes his approach to theology by saying, quote, "I simply want to think in communion with the faith of the Church, and that means above all to think in communion with the great thinkers of the faith." Newman is indeed one of these great thinkers of the faith with whom Benedict XVI thought in communion. Indeed, in the recently published Cambridge Companion to Joseph Ratzinger, the opening chapter on Ratzinger's influences studies three such teachers, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, and St. John Henry Newman. That there is a profound relationship in the thought of Newman and Benedict XVI is without doubt. That said, there are ways in which Newman's influence on Ratzinger is somewhat harder to pinpoint than the influences of Augustine and Bonaventure. Unlike them, Newman was not the subject of one of Ratzinger's academic theses, nor indeed an explicit interlocutor of one of his published books. This may indicate that the Newman influence is all the stronger, however, insofar as it is something consistently and pervasively perceptible throughout so many of Ratzinger's writers, and also in his life. As he put it himself on the eve of Newman's beatification, quote, "Newman has long been an important influence in my own life and thought." The influence goes right back to Ratzinger's salad days, after he entered the Archdiocese of Munich and Freising's minor seminary at Traunstein in Easter 1939, before beginning his studies proper after the war at the Philosophische Theologische Hochschule in Freising in January 1946. This is the bit I'd warned you about with the touchpad. Important characters from those days who introduced the young Ratzinger to Newman included his primary theological mentor and supervisor, Gottlieb Söhngen, someone for whom Ratzinger tells us Newman was, quote, "a favourite author." There is also the key figure of Alfred Leppel. On arrival at Freising in 1946, Leppel was, touchpad again, Leppel was appointed as prefect for Ratzinger's cohort of fresh seminarians, and he was himself at the time writing a dissertation on Newman's understanding of conscience, which was published in 1952. As many of you will no doubt know, there was a local devotion to Newman, which had sprung up in Munich during the war, after his writings on conscience became a central inspiration for the Nazi-resisting White Rose movement. Mention should also be made of the interwar theologian Erich Schwara, a Jesuit and key interlocutor of the young Ratzinger and of Söhngen again. And it was Schwara who had just recently translated Newman into German, and it's him we have to thank for bringing Newman to a German audience. Understandably, therefore, discussions of the Ratzinger-Newman relationship tend to focus on their shared understanding of conscience. I will discuss this shortly, but most of what I want to say today will instead be focused on a theme which is given much less attention, but which I think warrants much more discussion. And this is their respective approaches to interrelating faith and culture. My reasons for focusing on faith and culture are twofold. In the first place, laying out their respective positions on the question of how Catholic faith relates to different contexts, makes clear a profound convergence between them. In the second place, it's within this topic that I think some helpful resources emerge for providing a rationale as to the importance of the traditional Latin maxim, the only form of the Mass that Newman knew as Catholic, obviously, notwithstanding is being lazily named the Invisible Peritus of Vatican II ad infinitum, and equally obviously, this being the same form of the Mass that Benedict XVI could liberate via Summorum Pontificum. So before getting into any of that, let me discuss the way Newman's teaching on conscience was decisive for Benedict XVI. Firstly, let us recall that it is the witness of Newman's entire life which influences Ratzinger, rather than just isolated texts. The Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the first handwritten page of which you may have just seen in the museum, and if you didn't, I took a photo of it on my phone. It's the Apologia Pro Vita Sua which is the crucially influential work. The modus operandi of that book is to show that Newman had consistently valued truth above all else for the duration of his entire life. Newman focused on this as a way to defend himself against a charge of dishonesty. While that allegation was unfounded, the fact remains that for someone who had undergone so many changes of direction, not least converting to Catholicism, different texts of Newman's do contradict each other, inevitably. For this reason, Newman argued that, despite all the twists and turns of his life, there was one steady constant, his always having sought after the truth he was to find finally in Rome. The overarching theme of truth is at the centre of Newman's influence on Ratzinger, including on the matter of conscience. Ratzinger discusses this directly in a lecture from 1991, unsurprisingly titled Conscience and Truth. Newman's 1875 letter to the Duke of Norfolk is an important primary text here, particularly the often misunderstood comment about toasting conscience before the Pope. As Ratzinger points out, Newman means that the papacy should not be put in opposition to the primacy of conscience, but is rather based on it and guarantees it. That is, both conscience and Petrine authority, if working properly, if genuine, cannot contradict each other, insofar as each are intrinsically ordered to the truth. Both can exhibit infallibility in certain circumstances, one by nature, that's conscience, the other by charism, i.e. papal infallibility. So those like the Duke of Norfolk, who felt the definition of papal infallibility, would license terrible authoritarianism, were misguided. Ratzinger's recourse to Newman here seems to go right back to the White Rose movement and the German experience of terrible authoritarianism. He reminds us of a disturbing assertion made by the Nazi Hermann Goering, who said, quote, "I have no conscience. My conscience is Adolf Hitler." According to Ratzinger, Newman says, by contrast, I can toast my conscience before even the Pope himself, because both share in truth. One need not override the other. There should not be any conflict. Petrine authority is conscience's ally and not its foe. Now, no doubt some of you will be thinking that individual consciences can err. And today I'm not going to discuss whether Petrine authority can err, if you're wondering about that. Might come up in the Q&A. The possibility of conscience erring is important to Ratzinger's discussion. Conscience is always intrinsically ordered to the truth, always bound to it and searching for it, but there are some for whom it is unable to operate effectively and arrive at truth. Such circumstances are many and various. There are shades of invincible ignorance, or very poor moral formation, perhaps traumatic life experiences, or debased cultural circumstances, and so on. Ratzinger's lecture starts with this problem of an erroneous conscience. The Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae had affirmed that even an erroneous conscience must be respected, for man must never, quote, be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience. In the years following the council, however, Ratzinger relates that this affirmation had led to what he calls subjectivism, whereby claims of conscience always trump other considerations without discernment. And this is people saying, I don't need to do this or adhere to this or that teaching because my conscience is okay with it. His aim, therefore, is to establish the parameters for maintaining both an unswerving faith in the rectitude of church teaching and the need to respect the individual conscience, which sometimes threatens to go against it. Ratzinger applies Newman's witness to conscience to find a way through this impasse, as it was presented at the time by certain German bishops who set Dignitatis Humanae against Humanae Vitae. They had suggested that the individual conscience could permit deviations from church teaching when it comes to contraception. Ratzinger shows why this is wrong, and how it is that individual consciences can be restored to genuine truth through prayer, discernment, and ecclesial life. Ratzinger obviously wants to avoid the extreme authoritarianism which overrides conscience and was made explicit in the Nazi era. But more pressingly, he also wants to avoid the individualism which renders oneself impervious to the authority of the church. That is, people saying, well, I'm fine with it after all, and I can toast my conscience rather than the Pope. Newman's rejoinder about both church authority and conscience sharing in truth is described by Ratzinger as the vital middle term between authority and subjectivity, between church teaching and individual inclinations. This centralizing of truth will prove important shortly. But before getting into that, I'll also touch briefly on an intriguing description of Newman by Ratzinger as someone who offered him, quote, a theological personalism. He said Newman was someone whose personalism was in the line of Augustine. And one can surmise, therefore, what Ratzinger means by Newman's theological personalism specifically, a personalism grounded on the personhood of God. As he states in his last testament, this is Benedict XVI, God is person, and therefore the truth is person. For Newman, conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, an oracle of God given forth in our souls, the very voice of truth as person with which each of us is endowed. If only we would say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So that's conscience. And I'm now going to move on to the theme of faith and culture. In his essay on the development of Christian doctrine from 1845, Newman outlines 7 notes of what he considers authentic doctrinal developments in Christianity. And these are things which you can use in order to discern the rightness or authenticity of a proposed doctrinal development. Things which each development through history, he said, showed. There were 7 different characters of such developments. The third of these notes he calls the power of assimilation. This is an impulse he considers intrinsic to an authentic doctrinal development, whereby Christianity grows by taking into its substance external materials. This absorption or assimilation is completed, he says, when the materials appropriated come to belong to it and enter into its unity. Doctrines, he states, are not placed in a void, but live in the crowded world and make way for themselves by interpenetration and develop by absorption. The assimilation is not merely unidirectional. It's not that Christianity simply overrides the elements of the world with which it comes into contact and subsumes them. It is rather that such elements provide opportunities to expand, expound, and extend the range of doctrine, enabling it to unfold ever more fully and extensively. Now, Newman's description of this process is not purely ironic toward the world at large, far from it. The process of assimilation requires that external materials are, quote, subjected to a new sovereign, bringing them under the influence of a new element of order and composition. He says the living idea of the Catholic faith becomes many in taking into itself all manner of things, yet it does so whilst it remains one, maintaining what he calls a unity of type which means genuine assimilation is a form of development which by no means derails the integrity of the faith. On the contrary, doctrinal developments which exhibit this power of assimilation are those which are genuinely authentic. In his own words, life is proved by the capacity of expansion. The elements at play which are derived from the world themselves differ in their own readiness and capacity to interpenetrate with Christianity. He maintains that the more readily the faith coalesces with a particular context indicates the degree to which there is an antecedent affinity between the faith and that context. Some elements of the world, I'll explain this concretely shortly, but some elements of the world are well suited for assimilation, others much less so. Christianity corrects the world, he writes. Christianity succeeds by purifying and transmuting, as well as assimilating and taking into itself the many-coloured beliefs, forms of worship, codes of duty, and schools of thought through which it is ever moving. Now let me explain what this means a bit more concretely. A very obvious example is provided in the Nicene Creed. The formulation consubstantialem patri is unimaginable without the New Testament teaching that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. With the New Testament teaching that Jesus Christ is the Son of God having passed through the 3rd and 4th century Greco-Roman context. The teaching of the faith hereby assimilates into itself certain philosophical concepts of that context. Yet this was by no means a simple amalgamating of Greco-Roman thought and the teaching. If anyone sees it that way, I suggest you read the Fathers from the 3rd and 4th century, where it really wasn't a very easy process. The concepts were transmuted, purified, transformed, in order to be suited to their purpose, which was an unfolding of the basic message: Jesus is the only Son of God. As with discussions of conscience, a focus of truth is central here. One of Newman's other tests, the one which precedes this test of assimilation, is called continuity of principles. This is presented as a means by which, in seeking to discern the authenticity of a doctrinal development, that development is scrutinized as to whether or not the basic principles of Christian doctrine are the same before and with the development itself. Returning to consubstantialem patri, that it is to ask if the scriptural principle of exclusive sonship is adequately continuous with it, which of course it is. Newman states that if you destroy the principles in a development, the development is a corruption. Hence, Arianism is rank corruption. Sonship was destroyed by it. Saliently, for present purposes, the example Newman provides of all this in the development essay as one of the most fundamental principles at stake in Christianity is that, quote, truth is one, unalterable, consistent, imperative, and saving. He says this specifically is the cardinal distinction between Christianity and the philosophies by which it was surrounded. He also calls this test the dogmatic principle, that there is, quote, a truth and there is one truth. Excuse me. Now, Newman says that these two things are very closely connected, truth and the ability to assimilate. Because Christianity is true, it can assimilate that which is true in contexts external to it. The Greco-Roman concept of substance or nature and consubstantiality was thus serviceable and could develop into consubstantialem patri. And it could only be transmuted in this way, that is, ordered and corrected or perfected, because Christian doctrine is itself true. Otherwise, we'd be dealing with sheer amalgamation, something threatening syncretism. Or we'd be dealing with just arbitrary and strategic considerations, which ultimately threatens relativism. Development proceeds in part by assimilation, and assimilation is possible because doctrine is true. As Newman writes, Christianity has, from the first to last, kept fixed principles in view in the course of its developments, and thereby, with my italics, has been able to incorporate doctrine which was external to it without losing its own. Now, before I return to Benedict XVI, there are implicit implications arising from this, which constitute a gauntlet, I think, which is later picked up by Benedict. There's two I want to mention before I get there. The first is that Newman implies he has in mind a perspective which is broader than just encounters between Christian doctrine and philosophy. The example I'm using, consubstantialem patri, is obviously philosophical, but when Newman lists the external influences at play, he includes much else besides, some of which include also the category of what we would today term culture. Christianity can be affected by a culture, and indeed affect culture. Hence he says that Christianity takes into itself elements of the many-coloured beliefs, forms of worship, codes of duty, as well as schools of thought, to which it is ever moving. Also, it's assumed by Newman that certain contexts are elevated to a special status in their relation with the faith. The fact is that the doctrinal developments of the earlier centuries remain foundationally and supremely important for all Christians ever since. And for that reason, Greco-Roman philosophy and culture must have a supreme significance for all Christians. Now I want to show how this relates to Ratzinger and sketch out how his approach enables us to glimpse how forms of worship can similarly be understood as having a supreme significance for all Catholics and on the same basis. Now, what Newman calls this power of assimilation closely relates to Ratzinger's discussions of faith and culture in two lectures he gave when prefect of the CDF during the 90s. In these talks, he adopts a term, a neologism really, called interculturality, to distinguish his approach from the one which was then dominant in the Catholic world and has, since the Amazon Synod, maybe become dominant again, and that word is inculturation. Inculturation is the basic principle that the Catholic faith takes different cultural shapes in the different contexts in which it finds itself. This is obviously at least partly true, and to my mind can be a wonderful thing, especially as regards popular piety. When one unpicks the thinking behind it, however, there are significant problems in applying it to things like dogma, doctrine, and indeed liturgy. Inculturation was first outlined at length in the writings of the Superior General of the Jesuits, Pedro Urrupe. He applied two elements from magisterial documents to the question of relating culture and Christian faith after Vatican II. The first is a definition of culture in the document Gaudium et Spes, where culture is defined as, quote, everything whereby man develops and perfects his bodily and spiritual qualities. This means culture is always positive, always cultivating human nature. It's the ordering of human life towards fulfillment and flourishing. And then there's Paul VI, Evangelii Nuntiandi, which states that the gospel is independent in regard to all cultures, yet capable of permeating every culture without becoming subject to any one of them. Now, Urrupe took these texts to suggest that culture is always intrinsically good, always tends towards the perfection of human nature. And if culture is intrinsically good, then the Catholic faith can take shape within or permeate any cultural setting. As Urrupe defines it, enculturation is the incarnation of the Christian life and the Christian message in a particular cultural context, in such a way that it animates, directs, and unifies the culture and brings about a new creation. Enculturation supposes that all cultures are more or less proximate to the Catholic faith. Now, Ratzinger takes issue with this, strongly, I think it's fair to say. He argues that faith and culture are not separate things. Rather, human culture is always already religious. As he writes, in all known historical cultures, religion is the essential element and the determining core. This means obviously cultures will conflict with the Catholic faith in varying degrees. In very pedestrian language, not all cultures are Jesus-shaped. Moreover, the same insight applies to Catholicism as well. There is no faith apart from its culture as such. He always speaks, this is Ratzinger, of faith and its culture, or of faith's, what he calls, being German, cultural physiognomy. And he argues that a supposedly pre-cultural or decultured Catholicism will just give us an empty collection of ideas. Theology of culture is therefore always intercultural, insofar as it explores the encounter between different cultures, a Catholic culture and another culture. And this means some contexts are better suited to become Catholic than others. This, of course, threatens to provoke allegations of imperialism and Eurocentrism, which Ratzinger acknowledges. But he points out that mission was not originally perceived as expansion for the wielding of power, but to be a missionary is to work under the obligatory transmission of what is intended for everyone and which everyone needs. Ratzinger makes his point by returning to his usual primary category, truth. While he accepts that Catholicism is always a culture, and that non-Catholic culture is always in some way religious, or today pseudo-religious, certainly in the West, he maintains that the most effective means of distinguishing and relating these two is always to recall that Catholicism is true. Truth cannot contradict itself. So Ratzinger disagrees with Paul VI that the gospel is independent of culture, if we take this to mean that the transmission of the gospel is not itself always configured by some cultural history. Yet he would agree with the statement insofar as the gospel uniquely corresponds to ultimate reality, that the gospel is ultimate and absolute truth. Human beings, he writes, are not trapped in a hall of mirrors of interpretations. One can and must seek a breakthrough to what is really true. And this is the breakthrough of the word of God in the gospel. For Ratzinger, God's word is just this, quote, simply true. Putting truth to work in service of distinguishing cultures one from another is to ask how far the values and worldviews and ways of life of different peoples correspond with reality and with the ultimate correspondence to reality of Christ Jesus our Lord. He also says that Christ is not beyond culture, but brings with him those cultures which he has transformed through history. Because truth is a constructive point of interaction, Catholicism itself bears the elements of truth of the cultures which contribute to it, just as those cultures themselves bear witness to the influence of the Church. The main reference for this comes from Fides et Ratio, in which St. John Paul II writes that, quote, the Church can never abandon what she has gained from her enculturation in the world Greco-Latin thought. In and of itself, this is relatively uncontestable. It's extremely difficult to imagine a Catholicism entirely shorn of the influence of Greco-Roman culture, especially if we assume that culture includes philosophy. At the same time, however, Ratzinger was exceptional in his day by arguing that Catholic mission involves acculturation, which is to be acculturated is to become habituated into another culture. No. And he says in missionary work, you have to habituate those who receive the word into the Catholic culture. They develop new cultural habits. That is, adjusting its citizens into the norms of a foundationally important culture, and that is classical civilization as transmuted through the ages of Christendom. A further remark should be made about Ratzinger's own admission that this threatens what he calls the canonization of Eurocentrism. His response is that it is not Greco-Roman thought is simply closer to God than the thinking of other cultures per se. It's rather that Greco-Roman thought had itself encroached upon universality. Its philosophy had begun to open itself to universal truth, and so was particularly amenable to the universality personified in Christ. This is why the culture of the classical world came to be so profoundly intertwined with the Catholic faith, because it was the culture that had landed upon a universal reason, or logos, with a lowercase l. And this is the supreme antecedent affinity with the ultimate divine reason, or universal logos, that became flesh in Jesus Christ. What Newman calls an antecedent affinity is for Ratzinger an encounter with the universal. For Newman, universality is certainly assumed, but the key point of contact he shares here surrounds the importance of truth. The commitment to truth is not something to suspend in order to understand the encounters of faith and culture, It's the very means by which to make sense of those encounters. Both approaches bespeak the inherent universality of Catholicism itself. Because Christianity is true, it is universal. And because it is universal, there must be a framework for understanding its capacity to speak to contexts radically different from its origins. Moreover, both approaches involve an understanding of Catholic faith and culture by which Catholicism forever bears the marks of those developments from their point. For Ratzinger, this is expressed in terms of a paradigmatic enculturation in the Greco-Roman world. For Newman, it's an assimilation of foreign elements into the very bosom of the Church. In short, just as any Christian doctrine 101 or elementary catechesis must involve an acculturation to Greco-Roman concepts like substance, it should also involve an acculturation to the form of worship most deeply embedded in the Church's journey through history. The Mass of the Ages cannot simply be discarded any more than the formulation consubstantial patrum. So to close my discussion, suffice to say that Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, I suggest, actively contributes to part of the rationale for Benedict XVI's Summorum Pontificum, if anyone remembers that document. Blow the dust off it. Let's reopen. As he puts it himself, in the history of the liturgy there is growth and progress, but no rupture. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. And it cannot all of a sudden be entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behoves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer and to give them their proper place. As he explains later in his last testament, Benedict XVI felt it supremely important that something which was previously the most sacred thing in the Church was not later forbidden, and what was needed was the inward reconciliation of the Church with herself. In short, the Mass of the Ages was once held to offer a unique correspondence to ultimate reality, and it must by definition still do so for the same reasoning Newman always said: truth is one and unalterable. Something can't be true once and then not true again. That is, to quote Benedict again, the liberation of the old rite was not about tactical matters. It was not the mere pragmatism of accepting, as Summorum Pontificum puts it, that not a few of the faithful continued to be attached with such love and affection to the earlier liturgical forms. However vital this witness has proved, there's also, I think it's fair to say, a deep theological and philosophical reasoning at stake here. And as it stands, the challenge which Newman and Benedict XVI present us with as regards the traditional Latin Mass has, to my mind, not been surmounted, and definitely not been surmounted by those who would decry and despair at its continued usage. Thank you.